In the early 20th century, oil reshaped global power. It became the unseen engine behind armies.
Whoever controlled oil did not simply command energy. They commanded the future.
By the time the Second World War erupted in 1939, oil was no longer just a resource. It was a...
And nowhere was this more evident than in the struggle for the oil fields of Ploiești, Romania.
To understand why Ploiești became a battlefield, one must look at the changing nature of modern warfare. Armies of the First World War had already tasted the power of mechanization. Trucks, tanks, airplanes, and ships transformed the battlefield. But these machines depended on a single source: petroleum. Without it, war machines were silent. With it, nations became unstoppable. As Europe slid toward war once again in the late 1930s, the question of fuel supply became one of national survival. Germany understood this more than anyone. Lacking natural oil reserves of its own, the Third Reich relied heavily on synthetic production and foreign imports. Among these external sources, Romania emerged as a lifeline. The region around Ploiești contained some of the most productive oil fields in Europe, with pipelines, refineries, and industrial complexes that supplied Germany with a crucial flow of fuel. As Hitler prepared for large-scale conflict, from blitzkrieg invasions to aerial warfare, the importance of Romanian oil soared. This made Ploiești more than an economic asset. It became a pillar of Germany's war strategy. Every tank that rolled across Poland, every aircraft that took off during the Battle of Britain, and every ship that fueled in the Black Sea had in some way depended on Romanian oil. It was no exaggeration to say that Ploiești kept the Axis war machine alive. Meanwhile, the Allies recognized the same truth. British and American strategists understood that any long-term victory over Germany required cutting off its fuel supply. Destroying Ploiești would mean disrupting the enemy's mobility, slowing its industry, and weakening its ability to fight on multiple fronts. Allied planners often described the Romanian fields as the Achilles heel of Hitler's war effort, a vulnerable point that, if struck effectively, could change the course of the war. But striking Ploiești was easier said than done. Its position deep inside Axis territory made it extremely difficult to reach. It was defended by layers of anti-aircraft guns, fighters, smokescreens, and deception tactics. Unlike targets in Western Europe, which could be reached from England, Ploiești lay hundreds of miles away from the nearest Allied bases. To hit it required audacity, innovation, and a willingness to gamble lives on an uncertain outcome. The Romanian government, aligned with Germany, also understood the strategic significance of the oil fields. They strengthened defenses, improved production facilities, and collaborated with German engineers to protect Ploiești at all costs. The result was a complex, heavily fortified industrial zone, armored hard-pumping fuel into the Axis war engine. As 1943 approached, the war had reached a turning point. The Allies had begun to shift from defensive to offensive operations. Victories in North Africa opened the door to using airfields in Libya, bringing a daring idea into reach: an attack on Ploiești from the south. This new possibility inspired the concept that would become Operation Tidal Wave, one of the most ambitious and dangerous bombing missions of the entire war. But long before the first bomber lifted from Libyan soil, the stage had already been set. The road to Ploiești was paved by decades of industrial growth, geopolitical tension, and the evolving nature of modern warfare. Oil was no longer a commodity, was the lifeblood of nations. Whoever controlled it controlled war. Whoever lost it risked defeat. Thus, Ploiești became more than a cluster of refineries in southeastern Europe. It was a symbol of power and vulnerability, a crossroads in the struggle between the Axis and the Allies. And as the Allies prepared to risk hundreds of airmen in a single, daring raid, the world's attention turned to one question: could the oil heart of Hitler's empire be stopped? The idea that would eventually become Operation Tidal Wave did not emerge overnight. It grew slowly, born from frustration, strategic necessity, and the shifting momentum of a global war. To understand its origins, one must look at both the desperation of the Axis and the growing confidence of the Allies. In early 1943, by this time, the Second World War had entered a new phase. The German advance had stalled in the snow and ruins of Stalingrad. Rommel had been defeated in North Africa. The Allies were beginning to reclaim control of the Mediterranean. And for the first time, the United States Army Air Forces possessed enough long-range bombers to consider deep strikes into enemy-held territory. The question was simple but daunting: Where could these new air capabilities do the most damage? The answer, at least on paper, was Ploiesti. American intelligence had been studying the Romanian oil complex since before the United States entered the war. A small raid in 1942, conducted by 12 B-24 bombers flying from Egypt, had caused modest damage but revealed something far more important. A large-scale attack might be possible if the Allies were willing to take risks. Planners understood that Ploiesti was not just another target. It was a strategic nerve center, a source of fuel that kept the German war machine operating. Hitting it again would require far greater resources and a bold new strategy. This thinking found momentum after the Allied victory in North Africa. With control of Libya and its airfields, bomber crews could now reach Romania barely. The distance exceeded 2,000 miles round trip, pushing aircraft endurance to the limit. But it was technically achievable. This realization sparked discussions within the U.S. 9th Air Force about a radical operation, a massive low-altitude assault deep into Axis territory. The concept was immediately controversial. Traditional bombing doctrine favored high-altitude attacks, where enemy aircraft and anti-aircraft fire were less effective. But Ploiesti was no ordinary target. Its defenses were considered among the strongest in Europe. Planners feared that high-altitude attacks would scatter bombs across fields and towns, missing the vital refinery units. A new approach was needed, one that combined precision with surprise. Thus emerged the idea of a low-level bombing mission, unprecedented in scale. Flying just above the treetops, American bombers would approach Ploiesti undetected, skim over the terrain, and strike the refineries with devastating accuracy. The mission would rely on speed, surprise, and close coordination. If successful, it could cripple Axis fuel production and accelerate Germany's collapse. But the risks were immense. Low-level flight over hostile territory exposed aircraft to small alarms, fire, obstacles, smoke, and unpredictable terrain. The B-2 for Liberator, designed for high-altitude flight, was not ideally suited to such maneuvers. Yet the strategic value of destroying Ploiesti outweighed these fears. Commanders believed that a daring approach offered the best chance of achieving meaningful results. Planning for the operation intensified in the spring of 1943. Intelligence officers gathered updated maps, aerial photographs, and detailed analyses of refinery layouts. Engineers studied how to maximize bomb effectiveness against storage tanks, cracking towers, and power stations. Meteorologists calculated flight paths that would protect formations from early detection. The participating bomber groups, some of the most experienced in the U.S. Army Air Forces, were moved to remote Libyan airstrips to begin secret training. Here, crews practiced low-level formations, defensive maneuvers, and precision bombing techniques. Pilots were drilled to fly aircraft mere meters above desert sand, simulating the terrain they would encounter in Romania. All the while, planners worked under the shadow of uncertainty. No mission like this had ever been attempted. Success demanded perfect timing, flawless navigation, and coordination across hundreds of miles. Even minor errors could produce catastrophic results. As preparations continued, the operation received its official codename, Tidal Wave. The name symbolized the overwhelming force the Allies hoped to unleash upon the Romanian oil industry, a wave so powerful and destructive that Germany would never recover. By mid-July 1943, the plan was finalized. 5 bomber groups, totaling 178 B-2 for Liberators, would fly from Libya across the Mediterranean, pass over Greece and Yugoslavia, and enter Romania from the north. They would strike 9 major refinery complexes around Ploiesti simultaneously, delivering maximum destruction before enemy defenses could react. Everything depended on secrecy, speed, and precision. The men chosen for the mission understood the enormous stakes. Many sensed that the upcoming operation would be among the most dangerous ever undertaken. Yet morale remained strong. They believed in the mission, in the idea that their sacrifice could shorten the war and save countless lives. As the desert sun rose over the Libyan coast in late July, mechanics made final adjustments to engines, armor, and bomb racks. Commanders reviewed the plan again and again. Air crews rested, wrote letters, and mentally prepared for the ordeal ahead. The atmosphere was tense, heavy with anticipation. The birth of Operation Tidal Wave was complete. What remained was the executioner journey into enemy territory that would test the limits of courage, strategy, and aircraft technology. The stage was set for one of the most daring and costly air raids in American history. The Romanian oil fields, centered around the industrial city of Ploiesti, were more than a collection of refineries and pipelines. They were a strategic heartbeat of the Axis war effort, a vital resource that powered the military ambitions of Nazi Germany. To fully grasp why the Allies risked so much to destroy them, one must understand the extraordinary significance of these oil fields in the geopolitical and military landscape of the early 1940s. Ploiesti was not new to the world of petroleum. By the late 19th century, it had already earned a reputation as a major center of oil production. Romania was one of the earliest countries to refine crude oil commercially, and by the 1930s, it was among the top producers in Europe. This long history established a robust industrial infrastructure, drilling operations, pipelines, storage tanks, cracking towers, and refineries stretching for miles. Companies from the United States, Britain, France, and Germany had invested heavily in Romanian oil long before the war, making Ploiesti a crossroads of international interests. When the Second World War erupted, this industrial strength gained even greater importance. As Germany expanded across Europe, its military strategy based on rapid, mechanized warfare demanded enormous quantities of fuel. Tanks, trucks, submarines, aircraft, and naval fleets all consumed petroleum at a staggering rate. Germany's own domestic oil production was negligible, and even its synthetic fuel program could not meet wartime demands. Thus, Romania became essential. Following political pressure and diplomatic maneuvering, Romania aligned itself with the Axis powers. In exchange for military protection and promises of territorial support, the Romanian government granted Germany extensive access to its oil reserves. By 1941, German engineers, technicians, and security forces had established deep cooperation with Romanian oil companies, directing production with military efficiency. The output from Ploiesti was astonishing. At its peak, Romania supplied up to 30 to 35% of Germany's oil needs. This figure may appear modest on paper, but in wartime realities it was critical. German divisions in North Africa relied heavily on Romanian fuel to operate tanks and aircraft. The Luftwaffe, fighting on multiple fronts, could not maintain its operations without steady streams of petroleum. Even the Nazi U-boat fleet, prowling the Atlantic, depended in part on Romanian refined products. In short, without Ploiesti, Germany's ability to wage war would weaken dramatically. The consequences of such an interruption were not abstract, they were strategic and immediate. A fuel shortage would slow production lines, ground aircraft, immobilize armored divisions, and disrupt the transportation networks that moved troops and supplies across Europe. Hitler understood this. So did Allied planners. This is why Ploiesti evolved into one of the most heavily defended industrial zones in the world. The Axis command recognized that any successful attack on the Romanian oil fields would threaten the survival of the German war machine. Defensive preparations intensified throughout 1942 and 1943. Anti-aircraft guns, ranging from light-caliber weapons to the infamous German 88mm cannon, surrounded the refineries. Barrage, balloons, searchlights, and smoke generators were installed to conceal vital targets. Decoy installations were constructed to mislead enemy bombers. Fighter aircraft from both the Romanian Air Force and the Luftwaffe patrolled the skies. These defenses created a fortress of steel and fire around Ploiesti. Any attacking force would face a lethal wall of explosions, smoke, and concentrated firepower. To many military analysts, the oil fields were practically untouchable. This belief only deepened their strategic value. Germany trusted Ploiesti as a secure lifeline, one the Allies could not easily sever. Meanwhile, the Allies watched the situation with growing concern. Every month, reports indicated the rising efficiency of Romanian oil production and its direct contribution to German military operations. Intelligence analysts understood that each barrel shipped from Ploiesti extended the war, enabling Germany to resist longer and harder. The Allies had many targets, but Ploiesti shone like a beacon of priority, a vulnerable artery that, if cut, could change the course of the war. As the conflict intensified, the strategic importance of the Romanian oil fields became intertwined with larger geopolitical calculations. The Soviet Union, fighting fiercely on the Eastern Front, desperately wanted Romania neutralized or captured. British strategists advocated repeated strikes on Axis oil reserves to weaken Germany's ability to sustain long campaigns. And the United States, with its growing bomber fleet, was eager to prove the power of large-scale air offensives. All these motives converged on Ploiesti. Every fuel truck that left its refineries fed the Axis war machine. Every day that production continued strengthened German defensive operations across Europe. The longer Ploiesti remained functional, the longer the war might drag on. Thus, when the Allies contemplated a daring, low-level bombing mission against the Romanian oil fields, they were driven not by ambition alone, but by necessity. The stakes were enormous. Victory could cripple German mobility. Failure could cost hundreds of lives. In the strategic chessboard of World War II, Ploiesti was not a simple square, it was a centerpiece. A resource base so valuable, so deeply intertwined with Germany's survival, that it shaped diplomatic strategies, military operations, and intelligence priorities. Destroying it promised to weaken the Axis in ways no single battlefield victory could. This immense significance explains why Operation Tidal Wave would be launched with such urgency, despite the dangers. Ploiesti was a prize that could tilt the balance of the war, and both sides were prepared to defend or strike it at any cost. When Allied strategists began shaping the plan that would become Operation Tidal Wave, they faced a near-impossible challenge: deliver decisive damage to one of the most fortified industrial zones in Europe, deep inside Axis territory, using aircraft that were never designed for such a mission. Yet the urgency to cripple Germany's fuel supply demanded bold solutions. What emerged from this pressure was one of the most daring and unconventional strategies of the entire war: the decision to attack Ploiesti by flying at extremely low altitude. Traditional bombing doctrine of the early 1940s emphasized high-altitude attacks. From heights of 20,000 to 25,000 feet, bomber formations enjoyed relative safety from ground fire and could rely on formation integrity to improve accuracy. This method had worked in multiple theaters of the war, but Ploiesti posed unique challenges. Its refineries were spread over a vast area, with critical machinery hidden within maze-like industrial layouts. High-altitude bombing risked scattering bombs across empty fields or peripheral structures. Only precision could ensure meaningful damage. Complicating matters was Ploiesti's reputation as one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. The Axis command had encircled the refineries with hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, searchlights, smoke generators, and carefully placed decoy installations. German advisors had spent months strengthening the defenses, coordinating early warning systems, and constructing protective barriers around key refinery components. A high-altitude attack, even if successful in reaching the target, would almost certainly face catastrophic losses. These realities forced American planners to think unconventionally. They began exploring a method that almost all air forces avoided at the time: low-level bombing, flying only 50 to 150 feet above the ground. Such an approach would keep the bombers below radar detection, preventing the Axis from launching fighters early or coordinating defensive fire in advance. Low-level flight also increased bombing accuracy, allowing crews to visually identify and strike critical refinery units. However, it introduced new and extreme dangers. At such low altitude, aircraft would be vulnerable to small arms fire, ground obstacles, smoke, and sudden terrain changes. Despite these risks, the boldness of the low-altitude concept appealed to planners seeking a decisive blow. The U.S. 9th Air Force, newly empowered with a fleet of B-24 Liberators, championed the idea. The B-24 was fast, long-ranged, and capable of carrying a substantial bomb load. Yet it had not been designed for treetop flight. Its long wingspan, sensitive controls, and heavy fuel load made low-level maneuvering extremely challenging. Still, commanders believed that with rigorous training, the crews could overcome these obstacles. From the moment the strategy took shape, secrecy became paramount. The operation required the element of surprise. Any hint of Allied interest in Ploiesti could lead the Axis to strengthen defenses even further war, prepare fighter squadrons to intercept the incoming bombers. As a result, the mission was planned in isolation. Maps were guarded, briefings were limited to essential personnel, and training took place far from the eyes of spies or scouts. The training itself was intense and exhausting. Crews practiced over the Libyan desert, hugging the ground for hours to simulate the treetop approach into Romania. Pilots learned to navigate at low altitude without standard visual references. Bombardiers trained to release their payloads using improvised timing cues instead of precise altitude instruments. Navigators memorized terrain features, river bends, and city shapes to guide formations across hundreds of miles of enemy territory without revealing their presence. As the complexity of the mission became clearer, so did the risks. Low-altitude flight required perfect synchronization. If formations broke apart during the long journey from Libya to Romania, the bombers would lose the strength of numbers and risk missing their assigned targets. Any navigational error caused by weather, equipment malfunctions, or enemy interference could send aircraft into heavily defended areas, or away from their intended approach path. Yet the planners persisted. They believed that the combination of surprise, precision, and decisive impact justified the dangers. They envisioned hundreds of B-24s sweeping across the landscape like a sudden wave, striking the refineries before the Axis could react, a tidal wave of destruction so powerful that it would cripple German oil production for months. To achieve this, the plan required meticulous timing. Each bomber group was assigned specific targets within the sprawling Ploiesti complex. Flight routes were charted to avoid known defenses, while leading the groups to their assigned approach angles. Altitudes, speeds, and timing intervals were calculated to the second. Every detail was examined repeatedly, from fuel consumption to bombing patterns to emergency escape routes. Planners also faced the challenge of ensuring that every crew understood the importance of their role. Although the mission demanded precision, it also required flexibility. Crews were warned that once they reached Romania, the battlefield would be chaotic. Smoke, fire, and unpredictable defenses might force them to improvise. The low-altitude strategy offered the best chance of surprise, but no guarantee of coordination once the attack began. By July 1943, the plan had reached its final form. It was a daring high-stakes gamble that tested the limits of technology, training, and human endurance. The 9th Air Force believed it could work. So did the aircrews who had spent weeks preparing under grueling conditions. They saw the mission as a chance to deal a devastating blow to the Axis and shorten the war. The low-altitude strategy represented more than tactical innovation. It embodied the spirit of determination that defined the Allied effort at this stage of the war. It was a plan forged by necessity, shaped by pressure, and executed with hope. Yet beneath the courage and ambition, there remained an unspoken acknowledgement. The mission was dangerous, perhaps more dangerous than any air operation attempted before. As the final days of preparation passed, the crews readied themselves for the impossible. Engines were checked, bombs were loaded, maps were folded, and flight paths were memorized. Every detail was in place. All that remained was the execution, an audacious journey into the most fortified skies of Europe, at altitudes so low that any mistake could be fatal. Operation Tidal Wave was nearly ready to begin. The strategy had been planned, the risks calculated, and the path chosen. What awaited the airmen would become one of the most dramatic and tragic chapters in the history of aerial warfare. The story of Operation Tidal Wave is not only a story of machines, strategies, and targets. It is a story of the men who flew the B-24 Liberators, men who carried the weight of one of the most dangerous missions of the war. Behind every aircraft number and formation chart stood a crew young, determined, and bound together by the immense responsibility placed on their shoulders. The B-24 Liberator was a powerful aircraft, known for its long range, high speed, and heavy bomb load. But it was also a demanding machine. Its cockpit was cramped, its controls sensitive, and its broad wings made it difficult to maneuver at low altitude. For the airmen assigned to the mission, mastering this aircraft became both a technical challenge and a test of nerve. Each B-24 carried a crew of 10 men, each with a critical role. At the front sat the pilot and co-pilot, responsible for guiding the aircraft hundreds of miles through hostile skies. Their job required extraordinary concentration, especially during the low-level training that simulated the dangerous approach to Ploiesti. Every movement had to be precise. A slight miscalculation could send the bomber into the ground or into enemy fire. Behind them, the navigator and bombardier formed the brain of the operation. The navigator guided the aircraft across continents, using maps, stars, landmarks, and instinct skills that became vital when weather, smoke, or anti-aircraft fire disrupted the planned routes. The bombardier, positioned in the glass nose of the aircraft, was responsible for identifying targets and releasing the bombs with accuracy. During the attack, he would have one of the most exposed positions in the entire formation. The aircraft's defense depended on its gunnersmen stationed in the top turret, tail, nose, waist positions, and belly turret. These airmen had one of the most dangerous tasks. They had to protect the bomber from fighters and ground fire while braced inside small, often freezing positions. Their training demanded not only shooting skills, but the ability to stay calm as tracer. Rounds streaked past the aircraft during the mission. At the center of the crew stood the flight engineer and radio operator. The flight engineer monitored the health of the engines, fuel flow, and mechanical systems, constantly alert to problems that could doom the aircraft. The radio operator ensured communication during emergencies and coordinated with formation leaders when visual contact was lost. These 10 men formed a single, united team. Their lives depended entirely on one another. During training in Libya, crews lived side by side, ate together, flew together, and learned to trust one another completely. They practiced low altitude, flying until the roar of engines and the sensation of skimming above the desert became second nature. Every day, they grew more aware that the mission ahead would test not only skill, but courage. Many of the airmen were remarkably young. Some pilots were barely in their early 20s. Many gunners were still teenagers. Yet they carried responsibilities far beyond their years. Letters from home reminded them of what they were fighting for. Personal moments shared jokes, quiet conversations, hopes for life after the war strengthened their bond. Though they came from different states, towns, and backgrounds, the mission unified them in purpose. The approaching operation weighed heavily on every crew member. They knew the risks. Intelligence briefings emphasized the strength of Ploiesti's defenses. Rumors circulated about the losses expected, yet their commitment never wavered. These were airmen who had trained for months, who had survived harsh conditions in North Africa, and who believed deeply in the mission's importance. For many, the most challenging part was not the danger, but the weight of responsibility. The pilot knew his decisions could save or doom 9 other men. The bombardier knew that a single mistake could render the entire mission ineffective. The gunners knew that hesitating even for a second could allow enemy fighters to strike. Each man carried a piece of the mission's success in his hands. On the eve of the attack, the airmen wrote final letters, checked their equipment, and tried to rest. Some slept only lightly. Others lay awake, thinking about home, about the long flight ahead, or about the possibility of not returning. Yet when morning came, every crew reported for duty. Every man climbed into his aircraft, knowing that the coming hours would define their lives. The crews of the B-24 Liberators were more than participants in a military operation. They were young men asked to do the extraordinary. They were the heart of Operation Tidal Wave. And when they lifted off from the Libyan desert, they carried with them not only bombs and fuel, but the hopes of commanders, nations, and families who believed in their courage. Their journey into the skies of Romania would become one of the most heroic and harrowing episodes in American air history. Before sunrise, on the morning of August 1, 1943, the Libyan desert was shrouded in an eerie quiet. The air was still, the sky a deep blue fading into gray, and the horizon barely visible beyond waves of sand. Yet beneath that silence, an enormous operation was preparing to unfold, one that would send hundreds of American airmen into the most dangerous mission they had ever faced. At the isolated airstrips near Benghazi, Benina Solak, and Nadi Al-Jura ground crews worked through the night. They fueled the B-24 Liberators until their tanks strained under the weight. They loaded bombs, checked guns, inspected engines, and reinforced vulnerable parts of the aircraft. Every mechanic understood that for many planes, this would be their final inspection. The airmen arrived in the dim dawn light, moving with a solemn purpose. Some carried Lucky Charms tucked inside their jackets. Some folded letters into their pockets. Others whispered quiet prayers before climbing the ladders into their aircraft. They knew the stakes. They had seen the intelligence reports, studied the maps, memorized the routes, and they understood what deep penetration mission truly meant. If something went wrong, rescue would be nearly impossible. Inside each bomber, the crew took their positions. The pilots adjusted their straps and checked the flight instruments. Navigators unfolded their maps in the dim glow of flashlights. Gunners secured their turrets and loaded ammunition belts. Bombardiers tested their sights, aware that precision could decide the mission's fate. At the briefing that morning, the commanders had been direct. The mission was essential to crippling the Axis war effort. But it would be long. It would be difficult. And once the bombers crossed the Mediterranean and the Balkans, there would be no turning back. The return trip would be just as dangerous as the attack itself. Mission of no return. The phrase hung heavily in many minds. One by one, the Liberators roared to life. Their engines shattered the quiet desert morning with thunderous sound. Dust clouds swirled beneath the propellers as the planes taxied into formation. The sheer power of nearly 180 bombers taking off within a short window was a sight few would ever forget. Takeoff was itself a challenge. The B-24s were overloaded with fuel for the long journey, and bombs intended for the tightly packed refinery structures of Ploiesti. The heat of the desert air reduced engine performance. Pilots pushed their throttles to the limit, coaxing every ounce of power from the engines to lift the heavy aircraft from the rocky runways. Some planes barely cleared the ground. Others dipped momentarily before climbing above the dunes. And for a few, mechanical failures forced emergency landings before the mission had even truly begun. Once airborne, the bombers formed up into 5 groups, stretching across the sky in complex formations. It took nearly an hour for all aircraft to align, and they flew eastward toward the Mediterranean with the rising sun behind them. From the cockpit windows, airmen watched the desert fall away, replaced by open sea and endless blue. For many, this long journey across the water was a time to reflect. They thought of home, of families, of familiar streets, of futures uncertain. They thought of the mission ahead, the long flight into enemy territory, and the low-level approach into one of the most heavily defended industrial zones in the world. The weight of responsibility was immense, yet every man maintained his resolve. As the bombers approached the coastline of Greece, they dropped to lower altitudes, preparing for the treetop-level flying that would guide them into Romania. The engines droned relentlessly. The air was turbulent. The bombers grew hotter as the sun climbed higher, but the crews stayed focused, relying on training and teamwork. The further they flew, the more isolated they became. They were deep behind enemy lines, beyond the reach of Allied fighters, beyond radio support, and beyond rescue. Any malfunction, any navigational error, any mechanical failure could leave a crew stranded in hostile territory. Yet they pressed on. For hundreds of miles, the formation held strong. The mission unfolded according to plan until the first signs of trouble emerged. Wind shifts and altitude changes began to disrupt the carefully timed route. The mountainous terrain of the Balkans added unexpected challenges. The critical moment when the bomber groups separated for their different approach routes grew more complex under these conditions. But that moment, and the chaos it would unleash, belonged to the next chapter. For now, as the American bombers continued their relentless journey over foreign lands, there was only one truth. They had committed themselves fully. There was no turning back. Every mile brought them closer to the heart of Romania, to the refineries of Ploiești, and to the storm of fire that awaited them. The airmen had left Libya with courage beyond measure. Ahead lay the greatest trial of their lives. As the American bomber formation pressed deeper into Europe, the early calm of the mission gave way to growing uncertainty. The long, low-altitude approach was always the most fragile part of Operation Tidal Wave. With the bombers flying barely above the terrain, every shift in wind, every unexpected landmark, and every miscalculated turn carried the potential for disaster. And on this mission, the smallest mistakes would have enormous consequences. The first major setback occurred shortly after the bombers cleared the Mediterranean and began their approach over the rugged mountains of Greece. A lead aircraft, one responsible for providing essential navigational guidance, developed mechanical problems and crashed into the sea shortly after takeoff. Its loss meant that the carefully planned timing and spacing of the formation were immediately compromised. Crews attempted to adjust, but without their primary guide, the bomber groups were forced to rely on less experienced lead navigators under immense pressure. From the air, the Balkan landscape was unforgiving. Tall ridgelines rose abruptly from valleys, and shifting winds battered the formation. The bombers were flying so low that even small variations in altitude became dangerous. At times, gunners reported seeing treetops flash past beneath their turrets. The constant strain of maintaining such low flight left pilots exhausted long before reaching the target. As the formation crossed into Yugoslav airspace, further complications emerged. Clouds and dust pockets reduced visibility, making it difficult for navigators to identify key visual checkpoints. The flight plan required precise timing. Each bomber group needed to separate at a designated point, then follow unique routes into Ploiești from different angles. But as the groups approached the separation point, the earlier disruptions began to show. A combination of navigational errors, wind drift, and miscommunication caused the lead group, known as Group 9, to make a critical mistake. Instead of turning north toward its planned route, the group drifted west. The aircraft behind them, seeing the lead planes change direction, followed instinctively. Within minutes, 2 entire bomber groups were heading off course and deeper into the mountains, away from the intended attack corridor. The perfect timing and coordination envisioned by the planners began to unravel. In the confusion, the remaining groups attempted to maintain their original flight paths, but without the presence of the lead formation. Even they struggled to make sense of their position. The terrain was unfamiliar, and visibility remained inconsistent. With no ability to climb low altitude, was essential to avoid radar crews, had to rely on instinct as much as instruments. Early disasters soon followed. Some bombers, flying too low or reacting too late to sudden terrain changes, clipped trees or struck ground obstacles. One B-24 crashed into a hillside while attempting to regain formation. Another flew into a ravine and was torn apart on impact. From nearby aircraft, gunners watched helplessly as fireballs erupted below them. The mission had not yet reached Romania, and already the losses were mounting. Mechanical failures added to the mounting problems. Engines overheated under the heavy fuel load and punishing low-level flight. Oil leaks, clogged filters, and fuel pump malfunctions forced several bombers to break away and attempt emergency landings in hostile territory. For these crews, capture was almost certain. Despite the unfolding chaos, the airmen pressed on with remarkable determination. Crews adjusted navigation on the fly, using rivers, villages, and road patterns to reorient themselves. Some tried to climb slightly to gain a better view, but even small altitude increases risked early detection. Others pushed their aircraft to the limit, racing to compensate for lost time. As the bombers finally crossed the Danube River, the symbolic gateway into Romania, they were no longer the unified force envisioned in the planning rooms of Libya. They were scattered, fragmented, and arriving at different speeds and angles. The success of the mission depended on synchronized attacks, hitting multiple refinery complexes simultaneously. Instead, the Allied force approached Ploiesti in disorganized waves, each crew unsure of how much of the formation remained intact. Ahead of them lay the most heavily defended industrial zone in Europe. But even before the first refinery came into view, Operation Tidal Wave had already been marked by tragedy and by the cracks in coordination that would shape the catastrophic events to come. Yet, despite the losses and confusion, the crews did not turn back. They continued forward into Romania, into a sky filled with smoke, flak, and fire, determined to complete the mission they had come so far to execute. The storm of Ploiesti awaited them, as the scattered formations of American B-24 liberators crossed into Romania. A shift in the atmosphere was unmistakable. The quiet valleys and rolling fields below masked a deadly truth. The bombers were now entering one of the most heavily fortified regions in all of Europe. Ahead lay Ploiesti, the heart of Axis oil production. Every mile closer brought them deeper into the lion's den. Even from a distance, evidence of German and Romanian defensive preparations became visible. Smoke generators, disguised as innocent farmhouses or industrial sheds, were already active. Columns of thick artificial smoke drifted upward, spreading across the horizon in anticipation of the coming attack. The enemy had long believed Ploiesti would eventually be targeted, and their readiness showed in every detail. At low altitude, the approaching bombers could see everything. Soldiers running to ready their guns, anti-aircraft crews scrambling into position, and defensive posts coming alive. But what the crews could not see hidden behind the smoke and buildings was the enormous network of flak batteries positioned to tear them from the sky. The element of surprise, one of the mission's greatest hopes, had already begun to slip away. A warning had been sent earlier by German observers who spotted the scattered formations crossing the Danube. Though the full size of the force was unclear, the defenders of Ploiesti were no longer caught unprepared. They were waiting. The terrain itself tightened around the American bombers like a trap. The outer edges of Ploiesti were filled with small towns, factories, rail yards, oil tanks, and chimneys that rose abruptly into the flight path. Flying low meant every obstacle was a threat. Pilots had to maneuver their overloaded aircraft through a maze of industrial structures, smoke columns, power lines, and enemy fire. The B-24 had never been designed for this environment. As the liberators drew nearer, the anti-aircraft fire began first, as scattered bursts. Then, as dense walls of explosions. Black flak clouds erupted around the bombers, shaking the aircraft violently. The crews braced themselves with every blast, gripping controls, guns, and bomb release handles. Inside the vibrating metal frames, the roar of engines mixed with the deafening shockwaves of flak detonations. Gunners scanned desperately for fighters, but the low-altitude approach gave the enemy little room to attack from above. Instead, the danger came from everywhere else, from rooftops, from camouflaged gun pits, from trains fitted with anti-aircraft weapons, and from towers designed specifically to target low-flying aircraft. Every second brought the bombers deeper into the furnace. Despite the chaos, many crews could already glimpse the sprawling refinery complexes ahead, massive structures, surrounded by tanks, pipes, cracking towers, and industrial machinery. The target was close, but the cost of reaching it was growing with every mile. Smoke drifted across the sky in thick, shifting curtains. Some crews began to lose sight of formation leaders. Others were forced to break away to avoid collisions with obstacles, or to escape concentrated flak. The precise, synchronized attack envisioned by planners was dissolving in the violent reality of the moment. Still, the airmen pushed forward. Between the waves of smoke and fire, glimpses of the refinery complexes appeared like looming giants. Bombardiers readied their sights. Pilots steadied their hands. Gunners braced for the worst. Each crew knew that crossing into Ploiești's inner perimeter meant entering the deadliest zone of the mission, a place where survival depended on seconds, luck, and extraordinary courage. Operation Tidal Wave had reached its critical threshold. The lion's den lay open before them, and the real battle was about to begin. As the American bombers pressed deeper into Ploiești's industrial zone, they encountered a level of defensive power unparalleled anywhere in Europe. This was no ordinary target. It was a fortress in entire city engineered for war, bristling with weapons, protected by overlapping defense layers, and commanded by veterans of the Luftwaffe who understood exactly what was at stake. From the moment the liberators crossed the outer perimeter, the sky erupted in violence. Anti-aircraft guns, hundreds of them, opened fire in coordinated waves. The defenders had spent months studying possible approach routes, rehearsing their responses, and presetting fire zones. Their preparation paid off instantly. The flak around Ploiești was unlike anything the American crews had ever seen. Instead of random bursts, the explosions formed dense walls of black smoke and shrapnel, placed deliberately in the paths of the low-flying bombers. The altitude was so low that some explosions tore through buildings, rooftops, and factory towers as they tracked the aircraft. The B-24s flew straight into this manufactured storm. Inside the aircraft, the impact was terrifying. The metal skins of the bombers shook violently with each detonation. Windows cracked. Oxygen tanks ruptured. Engines sputtered under the shockwaves. Some aircraft were hit so hard, they veered off course instantly, trailing smoke or flames as they descended into the maze of refineries below. From the rooftops and ground positions, Romanian and German gunners unleashed a relentless barrage. They fired everything from small-caliber machine guns to heavy 88mm cannons. Some were mounted on trains, others hidden in barns, water towers, or behind false walls. The moment the Americans crossed into the city, these hidden weapons opened fire simultaneously, creating a deadly gauntlet. But the defenders had prepared even more sinister obstacles. To confuse the bombers, entire neighborhoods were fitted with smoke generators designed to blanket the refineries in thick, rolling clouds. These clouds obscured key structures, distorted navigation, and forced bombardiers to rely on instinct rather than clear sighting. For the airmen, the smoke turned Ploiești into a hellscape of shadows and explosions, where nothing was stable and every second brought new danger. Adding to the chaos, the refineries themselves became firestorms. Fuel tanks erupted in flames as bombs struck their surfaces. Towers collapsed, sending shockwaves through the air. Burning oil spilled into the streets, igniting rivers of fire that snaked through the industrial zone. The flames reached so high that some bombers were forced to climb abruptly to avoid being swallowed by pillars of smoke and heat, exposing them to more anti-aircraft fire. Then came the fighters. Romanian and German aircraft scrambled from nearby bases, diving into the melee with speed and ferocity. They attacked from low angles, darting between the smoke plumes and refinery structures, firing at bombers already struggling to stay in the air. The B-24s had little room to maneuver. Their low altitude left them boxed in. Gunners on the bombers fought back desperately, firing into the chaos, tracking fighters that appeared and vanished in seconds. The defenders of Ploiești fought with the fury of men defending their last lifeline. Every factory, every pipe, every tank represented one more day of fuel for the Axis, and they were prepared to pay any price to keep that lifeline intact. For the American crews, the intensity of the defense was overwhelming. Many had trained for flak, but none had imagined a battlefield where explosions erupted above, below, and to both sides, while smoke and fire filled every inch of open space. Ploiești became a cauldron, industrial inferno, whose defenses fused technology, terrain, and absolute determination. Yet even in this storm of steel and fire, the American bombers pushed onward, diving through smoke, weaving between chimneys, and releasing their bombs at point-blank range. The mission demanded it. Their comrades depended on it, and history would remember it. But the cost of entering Ploiești's defenses had only begun to be paid. The The moment the first American bombers descended into the refinery complexes of Ploiesti, the mission dissolved into chaos. What had been planned as a synchronized multi-angle strike became a frantic struggle for survival, precision, and direction in a world of smoke and fire. The low-altitude approach once, the mission's bold advantage, turned into its greatest vulnerability. The refineries were a maze of chimneys, towers, pipelines, and storage tanks, with smoke pouring across the sky and flak exploding at near point-blank range. Pilots found themselves flying blind through an industrial labyrinth. Some aircraft were forced to climb sharply to avoid colliding with smokestacks only to fly directly into flak bursts. Waiting above, bombardiers trained to identify targets visually now faced an environment where nothing looked familiar. Smoke hid key structures, fires distorted shadows, and decoy buildings confused even the most experienced crews. Many bombardiers released their loads by instinct, aiming for clusters of tanks or machinery glimpsed through momentary breaks in the haze. Some bombers overshot their targets entirely. Others turned too early or too late, circling back through enemy fire to attempt a second run, a nearly suicidal act. In the confusion, several aircraft collided with each other or with refinery structures. One bomber struck a tall chimney, splitting apart in an explosion that showered burning fuel across the complex below. Friendly fire became a tragic and unavoidable consequence of the disordered attack. With groups arriving from the wrong directions and at irregular times, bombers sometimes crossed paths with other formations moments before release. Explosions from earlier strikes shook the air so violently that incoming aircraft lost control. Amid the chaos, some crews performed astonishing feats. Pilots flew through burning corridors barely wider than their wings. Bombardiers released payloads at dangerously low altitudes, detonating tanks that erupted in towering columns of flame. Gunners fired at ground positions, even as their own compartments filled with smoke. Each second demanded instinct, courage, and impossible decisions. Yet, despite individual acts of heroism, the bombing patterns were badly fragmented. The refinery complexes absorbed hits, some devastating, some glancing, many tragically misplaced. But the full, concentrated destruction envisioned by the mission planners never materialized. The chaos of Ploiesti's defenses had succeeded in tearing apart the precision needed for the mission's success. When the bombers finally pulled away from the refineries, some limping, some burning, some barely holding altitude, they left behind a landscape of fire, destruction, and unanswered questions. But the greatest challenge still awaited them: the long, perilous escape from Romania. In the burning heart of Ploiesti, amidst collapsing towers and exploding fuel tanks, the men of Operation Tidal Wave displayed acts of courage that defied imagination. As their bombers were torn open by flak, riddled by ground fire, or engulfed in smoke, crews refused to abandon their mission, or one another. Some pilots held their aircraft steady, even as flames spread across the wings, giving bombardiers precious seconds to release their payloads. Others, mortally wounded, continued flying long enough to steer their bombers away from crowded neighborhoods, to avoid civilian casualties. One crew, after losing both engines on one wing, guided their crippled aircraft directly into a fuel tank to complete their attack, fully aware they would not survive. Gunners fought to the last breath, firing at ground positions even as their compartments filled with smoke and shrapnel. Radio operators transmitted final coordinates moments before their aircraft went down. Navigators dragged wounded crew members to escape hatches, choosing to stay behind when flames cut off their own exit routes. Everywhere across the refinery complexes, scenes of tragedy unfolded. Bombers crashed into rail yards, storage tanks, and open fields, scattering debris and fuel across the landscape. Parachutes blossomed in the sky, some drifting safely, others consumed by rising pillars of fire. Those who survived the crash landings faced capture, injury, or the devastating sight of their comrades lost in the inferno. Yet even in disaster, the airmen's bravery shone through the chaos. Their determination to complete the mission, to protect their crewmates, and to fight against impossible odds, became one of the defining legacies of Operation Tidal Wave. In those few terrible minutes over Ploiesti, heroism and tragedy were inseparable, etched forever into the history of aerial warfare. When the surviving bombers pulled away from Ploiesti, the sky behind them glowed with burning oil and black smoke. But the worst was far from over. Many aircraft were crippled, engines failing, fuel leaking, controls damaged, and wings torn apart by flak. Some tried to climb for altitude, only to stall and crash in the fields beyond the city. Others continued flying on sheer determination, limping across Romania toward safety. For many crews, escape proved impossible. Bombers went down across farmland, mountains, and small villages. Some airmen parachuted into hostile territory and were captured within minutes. Others landed injured and were taken in by Romanian civilians or resistance groups who risked their lives to offer shelter. Many crews found themselves prisoners of war, transported to German camps, where survival became a new kind of battle, one fought with endurance rather than machines. Those who managed to cross the Danube faced another challenge: the long flight, home with failing engines and dwindling fuel. Several bombers crash-landed in Turkey, a neutral country whose authorities interned the airmen until diplomatic arrangements could be made. A handful of crews, against all odds, reached their bases in Libya flying on one engine, nursing failing systems, and guided by pure willpower. The cost of Operation Tidal Wave was devastating. Of the 178 bombers that departed Libya, 53 were lost, and hundreds of airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. Many aircraft that returned were so damaged they never flew again. The mission inflicted significant damage on the refineries, but not enough to cripple German oil production. Within weeks, much of Ploiesti was already repaired. For the men who survived, the memories of that day would remain for a lifetime etched in fire. Smoke, courage, and loss. Their bravery became legend. But the price they paid marked Operation Tidal Wave as one of the most heroic and tragic air missions in American history. In the hours after the American bombers struck Ploiesti, the city burned fiercely. Towers collapsed, fuel tanks exploded, and black smoke rose so high it could be seen from miles away. To the surviving airmen, who escaped the chaos, it looked like a decisive victory, like the refineries had been permanently shattered. But on the ground, a different reality was unfolding, one that would ultimately define the mission as a costly failure. Almost immediately after the last bombers cleared Romanian airspace, German and Romanian authorities launched an emergency recovery effort, unlike anything seen before. Hitler understood the strategic value of Ploiesti, and he ordered every available engineer, soldier, and laborer to restore production at all cost. Romania, fully aware of its importance to the Axis war machine, responded with equal urgency. Despite the fires, much of the refinery infrastructure remained intact. While many tanks and peripheral structures had been destroyed, the core processing units, cracking towers, distillation columns, pumping stations, and key pipelines were not hit with the concentrated precision the mission required. Many of the most critical targets had been missed due to smoke, confusion, navigational errors, and the chaotic bomb runs. Within just a few days, Axis engineers were already repairing damaged equipment and rerouting systems. German technical units, some of the most experienced oil engineers in Europe, worked around the clock. Railroad workers brought in replacement materials. Fire brigades extinguished remaining blazes. Romanian oil workers, many of whom had spent their entire lives around Ploiesti's refineries, returned to their stations despite the danger, driven by orders, fear, or duty. The speed of recovery stunned Allied intelligence. Photographs taken weeks later showed a landscape still scarred by the raid, but operational. Fuel production rose steadily, and within 2 months, Ploiesti had returned to nearly the same output level it maintained before the attack. Despite the bravery, sacrifice, and destruction unleashed by Operation Tidal Wave, the mission had failed to deliver the crippling blow the Allies had hoped for. Several key factors contributed to this failure. 1. The scattered attack. Because formations were broken apart during the approach, the synchronized strike never materialized. Instead of overwhelming the defenses and hitting all refineries at once, the bombers arrived in fragments, allowing defenders to react. 2. Low-level chaos. The low-altitude plan, while bold, backfired in the intense smoke, flak, and industrial maze of Ploiesti. Targets were obscured, bomb runs were rushed, and precision was lost. 3. The strength of German and Romanian defenses. Ploiesti's anti-aircraft network had been built specifically for such an attack. Low-altitude fire was devastating, and the defenses remained largely functional even after the bombing. 4. The resilience of the oil industry. Unlike factories or military bases, oil refineries could often recover quickly by bypassing damaged components. And with thousands of workers and constant German oversight, repairs progressed at extraordinary speed. The tragic reality was that the mission had cost more American lives and aircraft than almost any other air attack of the war yet. The strategic outcome was minimal. German tanks still rolled across Europe. Luftwaffe aircraft still took to the skies. And the Axis war machine, fueled in part by Ploiesti, continued fighting for nearly 2 more years. Operation Tidal Wave had been conceived as a decisive strike, a bold gamble intended to change the course of the war. Instead, it became a sobering reminder of the limits of air power, the strength of a determined enemy, and the harsh price of miscalculation in wartime strategy. The courage of the airmen was unquestionable, but the mission itself, judged by its intended purpose, was a failure, and one of the most expensive in U.S. air history. Operation Tidal Wave left behind a legacy of extraordinary bravery, but also critical lessons that shaped the future of aerial warfare. The mission demonstrated that courage alone could not overcome flawed planning, insufficient intelligence, or unrealistic expectations. One of the most important lessons was the danger of relying on low-level attacks against heavily fortified industrial targets. While the approach promised precision and surprise, the maze-like infrastructure of Ploiesti and the dense smoke generated by defenders turned low-altitude flight into chaos. The accuracy hoped for never materialized. Another lesson centered on navigation. The loss of a lead aircraft and the resulting disorganization reminded commanders that long-range missions required redundant leadership, clearer communication, and improved systems for maintaining formation integrity. A single navigational failure could jeopardize an entire operation. The mission also highlighted the resilience of industrial targets. Even severe damage could be repaired quickly when an enemy had skilled workers, strong motivation, and logistical support. This realization helped drive the development of sustained strategic bombing campaigns that focused not just on single strikes, but on repeated, overwhelming pressure. Finally, Tidal Wave underscored the need for inter-service coordination and realistic assessments of enemy defenses. Ploiesti's anti-aircraft network was underestimated, and the cost paid by aircrews was enormous. Though the mission failed strategically, it became a crucial turning point in refining Allied air doctrine. Its lessons would influence future operations across Europe and remind planners that innovation must be matched with preparation, flexibility, and a deep respect for the realities of war. The legacy of Operation Tidal Wave reaches far beyond the burning refineries of August 1943. Though the mission failed to achieve its strategic objective, it left a lasting imprint on both American and Romanian history, one defined by sacrifice, resilience, and the brutal realities of modern warfare. In the United States, the raid became a symbol of extraordinary courage. The airmen who flew that day faced one of the deadliest missions in the history of the U.S. Army Air Forces. 5 Medals of Honor were awarded, 3 of them posthumously, marking one of the highest concentrations of such awards for a single operation. For decades after the war, veterans of Tidal Wave gathered to honor fallen comrades, preserving their stories so future generations could understand the cost of their sacrifice. In American aviation history, the mission remains a dramatic reminder that bravery can shine even in missions marked by tragedy. In Romania, the raid left a complex and enduring memory. The destruction wrought on Ploiesti was severe, with fires, casualties, and economic losses that shook the nation. Yet the rapid recovery of the refineries showed the determination and skill of Romanian workers and engineers. After the war, especially under communist rule, the event was retold in ways that emphasized resistance, national resilience, and the strength of Romanian industry. For many civilians who witnessed the attack, memories of low-flying bombers, exploding tanks, and burning skies became part of the country's shared wartime history. Internationally, Operation Tidal Wave influenced post-war military thinking. The raid highlighted the limitations of low-altitude strategic bombing and reinforced the importance of intelligence, coordination, and sustained air campaigns. For the Allies and their successors, the operation became a case study in how even the boldest ideas require meticulous planning and a deep understanding of enemy capabilities. Ultimately, the legacy of Operation Tidal Wave lives in a blend of honor and heartbreak. It honors the courage of the airmen who ventured into one of the most dangerous missions of the war. It acknowledges the tragedy of the lives lost and the suffering endured. And it stands as a lasting lesson on the complexity of strategic decisions, military leaders, and civilians alike, that war is never simple, and that even the most heroic acts can end in painful truths.